there's been a strain in American thinking, which is you administer a punishment beating to your enemies and then you get out. You don't attempt to nation build. That's the mistake.
These are the actions of a country that really has no concept of, or rather a governing class that has no concept of the national interest.
Yes.
This is a country committing suicide, I think.
What does it profit of a man to give up the Chagos Islands if he loses his soul? Hello and welcome to Quite Right, the Spectator's weekly podcast. My name is Michael Gove. I'm editor of The Spectator.
And I'm Madeline Grant, assistant editor and parliamentary sketch writer at The Spectator.
And this week, we'll be looking at what Donald Trump's audacious raid on Venezuela means not just for that country and for the wider Americas, but for the world and for a UK that is increasingly incapable of defending itself.
We'll be discussing the scandal around West Midlands Police after new information emerged about the rationale behind their ban on Maccabi Tel Aviv fans.
And we'll be considering what the cultural and indeed evolutionary impact of Wegovy might be.
Michael, over the weekend, we saw an extraordinary operation from America in which Nicolas Maduro was removed as president of Venezuela and extracted in a very high-tech mission without any American loss of life. I mean, an astonishing mission in itself. Fundamentally, what do you think is going on here?
I think that Trump was seeking to achieve two or three things. I think the first thing was he genuinely saw Venezuela as a carbuncle that needed a boil that needed to be lanced in the whole of the American hemisphere. In the American security strategy that was laid out before Christmas, which was criticized for a variety of reasons, he made it clear, the American administration made it clear that they regard the whole of that hemisphere as subject to an updated Monroe Doctrine, the idea that Europe and indeed anyone else should keep their noses out of what is essentially American territory or US territory. And that includes everything from Tierra del Fuego to the tip of Alaska, potentially even Greenland as well, which we may go on to discuss.
Yes.
And the fact that...
And Cuba.
Exactly.
Yes.
The fact that Venezuela, as well as being arguably a narco-state and certainly a failed economy, was also incubating terrorist groups and had the support of Russia and China, meant that it was a sort of standing rebuke to Trump's claim to have hegemony over the hemisphere. And so dealing with that was one thing. And I think there were two other things as well. One was oil, and the other was the war on drugs more broadly, and the way in which, particularly opioids, but actually other drugs, are a domestic enemy that Trump and Vance have set themselves against.
I don't think you could describe it as a full regime change mission.
No.
It merely takes away Maduro and intriguingly replaces him with an ally, you might call a Madurista, rather than a member of the official opposition, which actually does have significant democratic legitimacy because by all impartial, the best available evidence, they won the election in 2024 by a large margin, something like 70% of the vote. And yet Trump immediately snubbed them and appointed a Madurista. They're not talking about democracy. And there's even been an astonishing report in the Washington Post, which suggests that if Maria Corina Machado, the opposition leader who was banned, if she had rejected her Nobel Peace Prize, then Trump would have made her, put her in charge of Venezuela, which, if true, is absolutely insane.
Yes,
maybe this is a hyped account, but it doesn't sound not in keeping with Trump's demeanor and vanity.
You never know with Trump. If in doubt, look at the narcissistic explanation. So it's possible, but I suspect it actually has more to do with Trump's so far revealed preference for, taking military action, but taking military action with surgical strikes. I know that sometimes sounds like a euphemism because, of course, significant firepower is involved. But when he was giving his performance in his press conference at Mar-a-Lago afterwards, he referred to the action that he'd taken in his first term against Soleimani, the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. That was a sort of assassination. And he also referred to the strike against Iran's nuclear facilities, which was again, involved significant loss of life, but was a hit them hard, but don't deploy in a prolonged fashion. And similarly here, I suspect what was in Trump's mind is that the sheer audacity, as I say, and display of brute American power could be enough on its own to compel those remaining in the Venezuelan government, if not to the table, certainly to change their ways. So unlike with Iraq and Afghanistan, what we have not seen is prolonged commitment. And indeed, there is, precedent for that in that in Gulf Wars past, in conflicts in Iraq in the past, there's been a strain in American thinking, exemplified by people like Dick Cheney, which is you administer a punishment beating to your enemies and then you get out. You don't attempt to nation build. That's the mistake.
Yes, but what if, for example, there is significant civil unrest in Venezuela now? What if there are already groups of Chavista loyalists who are on the streets with guns? What if it's not plain sailing? Is there going to be the potential for further American intervention? What does that look like?
Well, he certainly said that there could be a step two, phase two. And he's also said that he's not afraid of having boots on the ground. It may be that he was replying impulsively because he referred to boots on the ground being an element of the Delta Force raid. So he's left the door open to a more prolonged commitment. And he's also created a potential hostage to fortune in saying that, he now runs Venezuela. So there is an open question about what might happen. But of course, for the Venezuelan government, such as it is at the moment, one of the questions will be, am I next? If I choose either open defiance or hostility towards Trump now, in anything other than the softest rhetorical terms, what might happen to me? Because Trump's prestige is on the line here. So it might well be the case that there's a temptation to try to rally loyalist, Chavez Maduro opinion behind resistance to the Yankee invader. But that comes against the backdrop of the unpopularity of the Maduro regime and the prospect of renewed American strikes or intervention. So, as I say, he may think that it's enough to threaten rather than to deploy. If he does deploy, there are some who've argued that it would be easier than Iraq or Afghanistan because you don't have the degree of sectarian division that existed in both of those
and perhaps there's
regimes.
A greater muscle memory for democracy as well.
Yes.
Given that the takeover happened more recently in living memory for many citizens.
Exactly.
And you do have a functioning opposition too, which
Yes.
actually did win. I mean, what do you think explains the sidelining of people with actual legitimacy?
Well, I think it may be the case that Trump is cautious for two reasons. One, he may think that it is better to say to those currently in power who are maintaining the integrity of the regime post-Maduro's extraction, look, I want Venezuela to be functioning effectively. I want American interest, strategic and oil to be respected. Play ball with me. And one of the lessons you may have learned from Iraq is that if you get rid of all of the figures in the former regime, you create a vacuum. And the second thing related to that may be that he wants to keep his options more broadly open. He may think that the evangelism that attended George W. Bush's adventures in the Middle East, where spreading democracy was the justification for intervention, was needlessly idealistic and wrong-headed, and that to try to say that this is a human rights enterprise, a pro-democracy intervention, would be to both legitimize a sort of conversation about foreign affairs that he doesn't like, but also potentially put American assets in Venezuela, oil assets and so on, at risk from a government which might actually subsequently have democratic legitimacy, but not do what Trump wants.
You were saying earlier, Michael, about the sort of, I guess, the escalatory language from the American administration. You know, in his press conference, Trump said that Colombia's president, Gustavo Petro, should watch his ass, and also that something must be done about Mexico. And of course, there's been some really quite bonkers saber rattling towards Denmark over Greenland. I mean, that there is a risk, isn't there, that with the astonishing success of the raid, the kind of thing that in previous decades, perhaps only Britain's special forces would have been capable of doing. And now, of course, we wouldn't have the military capability to launch an attack like that, even if our special forces were more than competent to do so. It gives a feeling of, impunity.
Yes. So the danger, of course, is that success in a military venture like this, and success where there's no American loss of life, there were a few members of the American Special Forces who were injured, but not a single American life was lost, further emboldens Trump. The old American dictum, the old Donald Rumsfeld dictum, is that weakness is more provocative than strength, and displaying strength on the world stage is obviously what Trump wants to do. But the risk of that is that because you've rolled double six, you think, well, luck or perhaps even God is on my side.
Yes.
And that can tempt you into a hubristic overreach.
And there are many in MAGA who genuinely do take that view after the president narrowly avoided assassination.
Right.
Like, they viewed that as an act of God.
Yes. And I don't know if you think that the rapid sort of racking up of potential next steps, whether that's Cuba, Mexico, Colombia, or Greenland, is an example of imperial hubris on Trump's part.
I think for a start, there are different competing factions within MAGA that take their own view. And it's just a question of like, which of these camps does Trump feel like allying himself with at any given moment? It's been fascinating to see some of the America First MAGA bros basically defending even the saber rattling at Denmark, which is completely insane, like a NATO ally, on the basis of basically like school bully rationales, like we're bigger than you, screw you, we do what we want, and we might take Greenland as well if it's convenient to us. It's really interesting to watch these people that used to be isolationists now defending the indefensible in that regard. But it's like, who's going to win out? Will it be the J.D. Vance, Elbridge Colby faction that is a bit more isolationist? Will it be the classic neocon hawk Marco Rubio style? Or is it this new kind of, there's a guy called Stephen Miller who's been a highly influential advisor to Trump on immigration. And he seems to favour, yes, exactly. And he seems to favour a much more expansionist policy.
Yes.
In fact, his wife, Katie Miller, who hosts a very popular MAGA podcast, a very influential couple within MAGA circles, she tweeted a picture of Greenland with an American flag over it, and she said soon. And then her husband was asked about this on CNN in the last day or so, and he basically was like, doubled down on it and said, yes, we need Greenland. We meant it.
Well, I think when it comes to the Latin American countries, there is a strong sort of domestic policy element which unites elements of the MAGA coalition behind the idea of intervention and or threats. So they can say, on the one hand, this is an attempt to deal with a flood of drugs over the border into the United States. And they can also say it's an attempt to put right regimes which have been exporting people, refugees and asylum seekers and illegal migrants into the US. So it's solving two of the big domestic problems, drug abuse and migration. And it's also likely to be popular with Hispanic voters in the US, many of whom, like Cuban Americans, like Marco Rubio, are refugees themselves from communism or from failed economic states. With Greenland, obviously, there is not a huge Greenlandish diaspora in the United States forming a key voting bloc in the Midwest. But I think the interesting thing there is that the Arctic is going to become an increasingly contested space in terms of geopolitics and defense. And the Chinese and the Russians are very keen on the idea that the Arctic should become a route for their navies and for their other forces to sweep past existing defenses.
Yes.
So whatever the unattractive nature of the Miller family rhetoric towards Greenland, they are raising an important question, which is what is the West's, if we can still talk about the West's, approach towards the Arctic?
What do the Americans hope to get that they couldn't have already? I mean, Denmark is a NATO member. There are bases at Greenland already, I believe.
Well, that is an open question. You're right.
Yeah.
And one of the points that the Danes and others have made is that actually Denmark has been one of the staunchest allies that America has had.
They sent troops to Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, there were loads of European countries and Canada that didn't do that. Of course, Britain was mug enough to do so. But this is a long-standing friend and ally. Yeah. And I do think it would put America in rogue state territory if they were to do this.
Yes. And therefore there is, I think, even for those who are most sympathetic to America and to Trump's position, there is, I think, a requirement that, not that I think that anyone in Europe is willing to accede to the American annexation of Greenland, but there is a requirement on the part of America to explain just what the problem is. And if it's the case that there are, as Trump has said, Russian and Chinese naval incursions and the defense exploitation of the space around Greenland, why can't it be the case that NATO can play its part? There is another element potentially as well, which is that Trump is doing this in order to say to NATO, I don't think that you're up to defending your territory. Come on.
And he's right.
Where's the extra expenditure coming from?
Yes. I mean, it's unbelievable to me that so many of these conversations we have domestically, the fact that we're still only on 2.6% defence spending, it's just not really mentioned at all.
Well, you made that point brilliantly in a piece you wrote reflecting on British foreign policy after some time in Venice, and you drew this very effective comparison between Venice having been the centre of commerce and the sort of home of enterprise and innovation, and then having become calcified over time and decayed, and the UK. And one of the points I thought you made very effectively is that if Britain is going to have control of its own destiny, to be a confident nation in the future, how can we, when our defence expenditure and posture is so weak? And as you mentioned earlier, the American special forces that were responsible for this raid model their tactics on the original SAS. But as we've discussed, not least with Dominic Cummings over Christmas, our special forces are in a state of almost open revolt against the government at the way in which lawfare and the threat of prosecution for simply doing their duty hangs over them. And so it's not just the case that we don't have the investment, we don't have the moral support that our military need in order to be able to play the role we might want them to.
And what you describe between the underfunding of our military and the persecution of armed forces, and I would add to that the giveaway of the Chagos Islands.
Yes.
These are the actions of a country that really has no concept of, or rather a governing class that has no concept of the national interest. We would rather listen to what a non-binding advisory judgment says that there is no obligation to follow through on, even if it harms our strategic position, which it does. We would still rather follow that treaty, which is completely advisory and non-binding, than do what's in the national interest. So This is a country committing suicide, I think, or the early signs of it, or at the very least it's the sign of a suicidal mentality within our governing class. It's very alarming because for me, the Chagos, although, a lot of people say, well, you guys never cared about the Chagos before now. Well, they weren't being given away before now.
Yeah, it wasn't a risk.
It wasn't a risk. And although there were discussions ongoing, I think there's a big difference between stupidly agreeing to sit down and talk about something and actually signing away concrete territory with vast annual payments. And to me, it's a very alarming thing because there's no obvious rational explanation for it beyond national self-hatred or potentially some more malign explanation. No one can give you an answer. And if you do press the advocates of this deal, and there are really very few of them, I don't see a lot of appetite for this on the Labour benches, they will say, well, Liz Truss started the negotiations. And you're like, great, what kind of argument is that?
Yes,
you guys hated Liz Truss. Like, what? Why? And of course, there is a difference, as I said, between sitting down for discussions and actually those discussions leading to a deal.
There's an irony. In the memoirs of Jonathan Powell, who is currently Starmer's national security advisor and who was Tony Blair's chief of staff. Jonathan Powell recounts this conversation that he had with Blair just after the handover of Hong Kong. And Blair says, we mustn't give up any more territory about the United Kingdom. And Blair's view, this is just a few months into his premiership, or a couple of years into his premiership, is clear that the idea that a country willingly cedes territory is a sign of weakness or debility or retreat. And the Chagos Islands, it's not a sort of little atoll with no significance. It's host to a significant defence base. It's a very important asset. And of course, the Chagosians themselves, a bit like the Falklanders, are not happy about the idea of suddenly finding themselves under another state's sovereignty. So either on democratic grounds, but certainly on grounds of broader national security, it's inexplicable. And again, it would be fascinating to glimpse inside Starmer's soul as he's given up this territory in order to potentially win plaudits from the international lawyer circuit and the human rights bar. And then those same individuals will be watching him twist himself out of shape, trying not to condemn what's happened in Venezuela.
Yes.
And, you know, what does it profit of a man to give up the Chagos Islands if he loses his soul when Trump makes a land grab far more audacious than any that would ever be contemplated by a UK government?
I really liked what Maurice Glasman gave a very interesting interview with Harry Lambert at the New Statesman recently, in which he was talking about Keir Starmer's psyche. And he said that he feels that Keir Starmer is becoming a sort of tragic figure now because he basically invested his whole life's work, his meaning, into this concept of the international law and this kind of like imaginary space jail that exists. You know, should you flout it? Of course, none of that is real. It's all guaranteed by actual power. Someone has to guarantee these things. And right now, the people guaranteeing things in the world are America, China.
Yes,
and,
quite.
you know, we're not living in the kind of world of cozy multilateralism that these people imagine. And in fact, having this credulous, trusting policy that everything would just be okay if we could just get people around a table and talk is what led Europe to neglect their military capabilities as they did, which now leaves us in this awful supplicant position.
Yes.
But the kind of tragedy of Keir Starmer is that having devoted his entire life to this mentality, of course he has to give away the Chagos, because to do otherwise would be to basically disavow his entire life's work.
Exactly, and to deny the one thing that's most important to him. As his biographer, Tom Baldwin, pointed out, when Keir Starmer was asked about his life, he said, there is no way in which my life makes any sense unless you think of me as a human rights lawyer. And now, woof, the whole edifice.
Everyone hates them.
Well, quite. And again, you know, the broader point is, some commentators have said, you know, the terrible thing about the erosion of the rules-based order and international law is that Russia and China and other bad actors can act with impunity. But was it ever going to be the case that Vladimir Putin would have said, I'd better not send these tanks across the border because there's an armory of human rights lawyers in Strasbourg against me? Would it ever been the case that Xi Jinping would have thought, do you know what? What we're doing in Xinjiang, I'll stop because I hear that a writ has been raised against me in The Hague? Of course not. They are actors in a realpolitik world, and Trump, whatever else he may have done, has reminded us that it is force that will determine in international affairs who gets to propose and who gets to dispose. And
this isn't to say that, you know, there shouldn't be alliances, discussions, dialogue, but the mistake is in thinking that the soft power can fundamentally replace hard power, which it just can't. And as we're seeing with Chagos, I mean, by the rules, by those rules, we ought to now be, you know, winning global plaudits for what we did. But where are these sort of magic means coming from? Like, no, we just look like a mug country.
Yes.
And inevitably what will follow is not the gratitude of the global south, but more calls for things like reparations. You can bet your bottom dollar. And
totally.
already Argentinian politicians are using the Chagos treachery as an argument for why actually the Falklands belongs to them.
Completely. And it's not as though we haven't seen this many times before. Historians of the 1920s and 1930s, particularly someone like Corelli Barnett, makes the point that the naive faith that the UK and its allies placed in the League of Nations at a time when we were failing to rearm meant that we looked like impotent, cuckolded hypocrites rather than those who were valiant for truth and defending small nations. And it was only with the capacity to exercise hard power in defense of our values that we were able eventually to prevail. And that's why I think that the key question should always be, when protests are made by people about any of these actions that they consider to be inappropriate, what have they done recently in order to strengthen Britain's defence, to defend British territory, to say that the United Kingdom's voice in international councils should be backed up by strength? And the line that Malcolm Rifkin used in the past, which I think is true, is that international diplomacy without armaments is like an orchestra without instruments.
Yes. And we have now a situation where, the politics of this are very clear. Our government has made the choice that it will neglect our military to pump more money into the welfare system.
Yes.
Because it's lost the support of its own MPs. They will still sort of talk a good game on military, but isn't that just the calculation that has been made? And this is precisely what the Americans always accuse us of doing, and it's completely true.
We're subsidising people to be idle, and at the same time, our own army, in terms of personnel, is being hollowed out. This may be a subject, I think it is one that we should return to. Mm-hmm. But again, one of the things that one of our correspondents, Alan Mallinson, has pointed out, and that you and I have heard direct from others, is that if you look at the recruitment of the British Army, you will find that many of those who are currently in uniform are not British citizens. They're not even from traditional recruiting grounds like Nepal, where the Gurkhas come from, or Fiji. They're from other countries, Commonwealth and African countries, where individuals have joined the British Army. Fair play to them, no criticism of them. But you now have a situation where a significant proportion of soldiers are in a condition where their grasp of English is so poor that they are not competent to follow orders given by the civil authority during an emergency. And we are presiding over a Potemkin armed forces in that sense. And the defence chiefs know it. And I think one of the things that we should probably return to, and we may have an appropriate guest, who knows, in the future to look at this, is the way in which we've allowed the corrosion of our military strength and our hard power from every point of view. We've discussed on the podcast before the curious case of West Midlands Police and their decision to ban the fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv, the Israeli team, from a fixture that Maccabi Tel Aviv were playing at Villa Park against Aston Villa. Now, at the time, West Midlands Police said that there were real risks involved, and they produced what they said was intelligence to justify it. But thanks to the dogged work of the Conservative MP Nick Timothy, aided, it must be said, by the non-affiliated peer Ian Austin, Lord Austin, that story has unravelled. Mm-hmm. And we've now got a situation where it appears that West Midlands Police have been fixing the evidence to fit the conclusion that the fans from Israel should have been banned. And it's an unhappy story that doesn't reflect well either on them or on your home city, Maddie.
Yes. I don't want to say it's astonishing, because I think we've already had many signs and news stories that do suggest that we're actually not living in a world of equal policing anymore, but in a dramatically two-tier system in which policing is not carried out without fear or favour, but it's essentially a form of crowd control in which the groups that the police fear could create the most trouble are the ones who get to dictate the terms for everybody else. So this story's come out that they took that decision partly in conclave with different Islamic organisations.
Yes.
and the so-called community leaders, some of whom have some really dodgy links, have hosted hate preachers, dodgy mosques, etc. And yet that is considered an acceptable way for the police to essentially decide how the law is applied. Like, I think it's a really shocking story. We've already had glimpses of it. Obviously, the famous case of the school teacher in Batley who remains in hiding. And there was that shocking story from Kettlethorpe School, I think it was it Wakefield, where a teenage boy brought a Quran into school as a prank. And while he was there, the Quran was scuffed accidentally, right? And then rather than saying, these things happen, teenage boys do some stupid things, it became this like enormous incident in which one of the boys' mothers took part in like a press conference, essentially, alongside different community leaders and a member of the local police force, therefore giving it legitimacy, in which she sort of begged for her son not to be punished too harshly. Like, it was almost looked to me like she was pleading for her son's life. I mean, that is the reality of things now, but this is a particularly flagrant example.
It is. In the occasions that you mention, it's almost as though a fatwa was placed against a teacher, a fatwa was placed over a child, and here a fatwa appears to have been enforced by West Midlands Police over the city of Birmingham on Jewish fans.
Yeah.
Why do I say that? Because originally it appears that when a security assessment of this match was drawn up, there was an acknowledgement that there might be a threat to visiting Israeli fans from protesters in Birmingham. But then that was just turned round. And actually, the threat was assumed to come from the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans to people in Birmingham. And in order to justify that, the West Midlands Police propaganda machine said that they'd consulted the Jewish community in Birmingham, quite a small community actually. Not at all, no evidence of that. They also said that the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans had run a riot when they were playing in the Netherlands. Yes, there were clashes, and yes, some of the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans did say and chant some unsavoury things. Mind you, I've been in all sorts of football grounds where all sorts of unsavoury things have been chanted, and it hasn't led to the matches being cancelled or the away fans being
And they were
banned.
also attacked in the Netherlands.
And the key thing is that they were attacked. So, the Birmingham police, the West Midlands police said that, there was evidence of people being thrown in canals. Yeah, the evidence was that they were either Maccabi Tel Aviv fans or the Jewish citizens of Amsterdam who were thrown into the canals, not the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans doing the throwing. It's also the case that when the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans were in the Netherlands, that local youths organised what they called a Jew hunt against the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. So, it was definitely the case that they were more victims, far more victims than victimizers. But then this is completely turned around, and it's clear that there were councillors who were arguing for the fatwa to be enforced on these visiting fans, who had previously argued for a boycott of Israel because of what had been going on in Gaza. So their views were predetermined, and they were clearly operating from an ideological point of view. And then the local Gaza Independent MP Ayub Khan was clearly driven by hostility towards Maccabi Tel Aviv from an ideological point of view rather than a community safety point of view. And the police buckled. And they basically said, okay, in this city, you're the bigger mob, you rule. And that is, to my mind, indefensible.
It's actually really, really heartbreaking. I mean, Nick Timothy comes from Birmingham originally, so I think there is something particularly upsetting when you see these things happening in the place where you grew up. Birmingham was once an extremely prosperous and well-governed city, and it's just heartbreaking to see it descending into this rampant sectarianism. But also, until these stories come out, no one will really acknowledge what is clearly happening. I'm very glad that this story is now in the public domain, because it's just it's too extreme an example for people to kind of dismiss and say, oh, you're imagining it. Two-tier policing is it's a conspiracy theory. In fact, there was a story reported in the Telegraph a while ago, which found that there's a particular unit which was set up by the government during the COVID years that was sort of monitoring social media. That unit continues to operate now. I think it's within the Department for Science and Technology. But they now monitor for extremist narratives, quote unquote, which include things like two-tier policing. Like this is not extremist thinking. This is like a very undeniable fact.
Yes, it's a statement of the bold truth.
Yeah.
And you are right about the problem in Birmingham going some way back. And I've got the scars on my back from that, as it were. When I was Education Secretary, it was the case that there were a number of state schools, not faith schools, state schools, in which a group of teachers and governors were attempting to take these state schools and to give them a defiantly Islamic character as part of an ideological agenda, inviting extremist speakers, separating the sexes, shifting the curriculum. The whistle was originally blown by teaching unions and by teachers who had seen what was going on and objected to it. But the attitude of the local authority in Birmingham and the police and everyone else, and indeed Birmingham's MPs, with one exception, was denial.
Of course.
And we were accused of...
A conspiracy theory again.
Yeah, we were accused of...
A hoax, it was called, Yeah,
exactly. And detailed evidence, police investigation, Ofsted investigation, union testimony, all showed that this was happening. But Birmingham MPs, like the otherwise relatively sensible Liam Byrne, said that we were conducting some sort of, racist or Islamophobic vendetta or witch hunt.
Yeah.
And the problems, they weren't first identified then, but they were clear then, no action taken.
Which is, by the way, exactly what they said about the grooming gangs, until, again, the weight of evidence became so great that the authorities had to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
Like this, we've seen this playbook before.
And I think that you can't have a situation, exactly as you say, where the operation of policing and the idea of impartial justice is corrupted because the police are too worried about the reaction from a particular community and terrified about the accusation of appearing to be prejudiced. And of course, you want those leading a police force to be keen to ensure that there are good community relations. You don't want to go back to an early 1980s approach where the police disdain engagement with minority communities. However, you certainly do not want to have a situation where the police can't operate without fear or favour. And exactly as you say, that's what happened with grooming gangs. That's what's happened in Birmingham. That is also one of the problems with the Manchester Arena bombing, where it was reported that the security folk there were scared to intervene to potentially stop the bomber for fear of being thought to be racist, Islamophobic or discriminatory. And that is no way either to uphold justice or actually to build good community relations.
We're very good at learning the wrong lessons from tragedies, I think. After the Southport massacre, the conversation in Parliament tended towards Amazon and how it was that he'd been able to buy those knives. We saw this again with the murder of David Amos. And, of course, with the Manchester Arena, the official response to that tragedy was to bring in Martin's Law, which places burdens on large and small venues.
Yes, there is those colours on the loose. So the answer is to get church halls to fill in more forms.
Yes, and the problem is it's really hard to make this argument because obviously it's named after a victim of that tragedy, and it's been supported by his mum who's been campaigning for it, and no one wants to be unpleasant. It's quite hard to criticise these things without being accused of not caring. But actually, I would say the more salient lesson is that the authorities were so worried about approaching someone suspicious for fear of being called racist. I mean, that seems like a very applicable problem that could apply in many different situations.
Yes.
No,
totally. And you're absolutely right. The grief of Martin's mother has to be respected. None of us can imagine what it's like to lose a child. And it's also the case that her campaigning energy is admirable. But it's the responsibility of government to draw the right lessons from these mistakes. And again, with Southport, one of the questions, which I don't think has been adequately asked, and it's a very tough one, is if we are accepting people who are refugees from conflicts which have involved the most horrific violence, what impact does that have overall? So it is entirely understandable that we should say that people from Rwanda or from Eritrea who have suffered, and Somalia, who've suffered horrifically or have witnessed horrific suffering,
Or maybe, because
should come to the UK. But it's not a risk-free enterprise for the UK.
And the Manchester Arena was carried out by a Libyan migrant, I think, who'd also fled a failed state.
Yes.
These questions are really, really difficult. But it begins with us having an honest conversation about what's going on. I do feel like things are starting to change, that we're able to have conversations more freely. And this is partly because of social media, actually.
Yes, I think it is definitely the case that a more open conversation helps. I think it is also the case that the debate becomes more based because there are more unarguable facts on the ground, and you also have people like Nick Timothy who are brave enough to keep making an argument and keep it running through the evidence in order to ensure that we can get back to reality.
We've already seen how the extraordinary explosion in the number of people using weight loss jabs like Ozempic, Mounjaro, Wegovy. I suspect this will only intensify in the new year. And at some point in the near future, we will find that the price of these drugs is going to flatten massively as I think patents expire and they become more readily available. I'm actually absolutely fascinated by what this means for society.
Yes, and on the one hand, it seems, and maybe this is just the Scottish bit of me, it seems that pain-free weight loss seems like cheating. That in order to
suffering and pain.
In order to achieve weight loss, you either need to have exercise or diet or some form of self-denial or self-abnegation in order to get there, that you need to have the mortification of the flesh before you can have the more enlightened or elevated state of, if not weightlessness, certainly weight loss. But actually, I find it hard to argue rationally against weight loss medication. And there may be all sorts of potential side effects, of course. But if we accept statins, if we accept that there are drugs that people can take in order to limit the toxic or life-limiting impact of particular conditions, should we really resist it? Now, if it's the case that these drugs lead to an entirely passive and a listless embrace of some sort of lotus-eating languor on the part of the nation, then that might be a problem. But I don't think it does, or does it?
I mean, it's still quite an early days with this stuff, so we don't necessarily know all of the side effects. And I do think that there may be a problem where people they lose weight, but these drugs suppress the appetite. And people who've had non-stop food cravings all their life suddenly find that food noise is relaxed. Equally, though, if people can lose weight that easily without the appetite bits, I wonder if it may encourage people to take a more lax approach towards, for example, their health and fitness, and perhaps even things like muscle formation, which is so important, because I think the drugs cause a natural wastage of muscle if you're not looking after yourself very carefully and getting sufficient protein and doing sufficient exercise. So it kind of is the easy way out. And I can understand why maybe this is quite sort of dour and puritanical of me too, but people who've been quite careful with their diet and done it the boring way and now seeing people who just sort of vanish before their very eyes. I do at least think people should be honest if they are taking drugs. You know what I mean?
Oh, yes.
If you've lost all that weight, you have to just come clean and be like, I'm on the jabs. You also don't get to say that this was some great achievement on your part when you've just got the best of Danish farmer behind you.
Exactly. A bit like having AI done all of your presentation or, having your mum do your homework for you. You should be honest enough about it to acknowledge that it's not your own unaided efforts. I think you're right. I think that, again, we have to remember it's a medication. It is something at the moment which requires to be prescribed or which isn't automatically available to anyone who just wants it, though, there are questions about how easy the availability of these drugs is, certainly to people who've got the money to command them. But the medicine, and therefore they should be taken as part of a regime overall, with an appreciation, as you quite rightly point out, of the fact that you can lose muscle mass, and you need to make sure that you get appropriate nutrition overall, and you mustn't neglect more broadly, if you're going to go down this route, the impact on fitness overall. But I think, even though there's a bit of me that, curiously, aesthetically, doesn't like the idea of people injecting themselves every day or however often it is. Nevertheless, it does seem very hard to say that if this will mean that people are less likely to overeat, less likely to be obese, that's a bad thing. And again, without wanting to seem like a sort of desiccated calculating machine, if there are fewer people who are carrying excess poundage, that will actually be good for demand on the healthcare system overall. I mean, there'll be fewer people developing early onset diabetes or with heart conditions or any of these expensive and sometimes tragic illnesses.
Although the people who may cost the most in the long term are those who live long and very healthy lives and then die of nothing. Although it's quite hard to have these conversations without sounding like macabre. I wonder what it will do to our culture of food and cuisine and dining. Because I've had many a dinner party post Ozempic days where you've cooked something, put a lot of time into the cooking, and then you have these guests who just don't really want to eat very much of it. And I kind of think that's a bit... No, I feel like we're already going in that direction. We're becoming like more of a small plates country than we used to be.
I think that is a real risk. And I think that, coming back to your earlier point, I know it's very tedious if you're inviting people to come round and you have to ask them whether or not they are gluten intolerant, lactose intolerant, if there are any other dietary conditions or preferences which you have to take into account. And now you might well have to ask, or at least invite them to reveal whether or not they're on the jabs and whether or not they want their smallest of portions or smallest of plates.
Yes. Will you eat these carbs that I've lovingly prepared for you?
And it does, because one of the nice things about being the host or hostess is seeing people tuck in. You want to see people enjoy the effort and the fat that you've lavished on their dishes. And so, in that sense, you obviously don't want to make anyone feel too uncomfortable, but there is a sense in which if they are going to be, Jack Sprat's wife around the table, that it's nice to know beforehand. You didn't necessarily share the information with everyone else, but if they can at least tell whoever it is who's been good enough to cook for you that you're not going to be able to be the trencherman of the year at their table, then so much better.
Well, we can't have everyone on the jabs. That's the point. You do need a few. I have a few guests who sometimes cook dinner for, who can always be relied upon to clean their plate and then ask for seconds or thirds. And those Hoover people are very useful, I think. Yes. You don't want to be stuck with like a whole casserole that needs to be eaten over the course of the next week. I wonder though, there will come a time where this will have become much cheaper and potentially available to almost everyone, because right now it's a real financial burden. So only those that were perhaps most invested in losing the weight or had enough money to burn are the ones on it. But if the price comes down, which I suggest it probably will, of semaglutides generally, I wonder if this could create a kind of inversion of body standards, because if everyone is thin or everyone could be thin, will that create a demand for the elite to be something different?
Yes.
So this happened with tanning already. It used to be the case that only people that the kind of international jet set who could afford to go on foreign holidays could have a tan or could have reliably a tan all through the year. And then when package holidays and cheap flights became a thing, suddenly everybody was tanned, and then being pale became more of a high status thing once more.
Yes, I think you might be right. It might be the case that in the future, one of the ways in which you mark out the fact that you don't give a fig because you're wealthy enough to transcend what other people think of you is the fact that you've been snacking on Dubai chocolate all day.
I'm not saying it will be, by the way, I'm not saying that the elite thing will be to
you need
be
a
like...
first-class seat on the plane in order to get on. So, it may be that Henry VIII and Robbie Coltrane become the high-status role models.
No, I don't think that will happen, but maybe it will be more like Renaissance art, where the beauty standard is to be voluptuous. I don't think morbidly obese will ever be the beauty standard again, but maybe more like Rubenesque figures.
Yes, that may be the case, but we don't know, of course, where this trend will take us. And I think it is still the case that, without wanting to be too a reductionist, that some of our notions of beauty and attractiveness are hardwired into us by evolutionary biology. And so it is the case that a certain curvaceousness and a certain, in particular, grace to the way in which your hips present themselves acts as a sort of, a prompt to attraction. You
can't undo millennia of evolution in one fell swoop.
No.
Yeah.
And so, in that sense, I think that even though some of the fashion notions of beauty and some of the popular attractiveness of a particular, body image may be reinforced by these diet medicines, I think it's also the case that there will still be a recognition, which I think is not just born of evolutionary biology, but actually is aesthetically right, that in the words of James Leese Milne, men should be manly and women should be womanly.